David Rodriguez never thought his life would amount to much. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd clock in at the Grand Symphony Hall, one of the most famous music venues in the city. While world-class musicians prepared for their performances, David pushed his cleaning cart through endless hallways, invisible to everyone around him. The 29-year-old had been working as a janitor for 3 long years. His daily routine never changed. Mop the floors, empty the trash bins, wipe down the mirrors, clean the bathrooms, and most importantly, prepare the stages after each rehearsal and performance. David's hands were rough from years of hard work. His uniform was always spotless, but it marked him as someone who didn't belong in the world of classical music that surrounded him every day. The musicians, dressed in their elegant clothes, barely looked at him when he walked by. To them, he was just part of the building, necessary but forgettable. But David had a secret that nobody knew. Every night after work, he'd go home to his small apartment and sit at an old keyboard he'd bought for $50 at a garage sale. The keys were yellow with age, and some of them stuck when pressed too hard. But it was his treasure. He'd learned to play piano completely on his own, without a teacher, without proper lessons, without anyone believing in him. David spent hours watching free videos online, pausing and rewinding them countless times until his fingers could copy what he saw. His neighbors sometimes complained about the noise, but David couldn't stop. Music was the only thing that made him feel alive. Growing up poor had taught David that dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford. His father had left when he was 12, leaving his mother to raise 3 children alone. David, being the oldest, had to work part-time jobs throughout high school just to help pay for groceries. College was never an option. The day after graduation, he was already looking for full-time work. His mother always told him he was talented. When he was young, before life got complicated, she'd saved up enough money to pay for 6 months of piano lessons. David still remembered his teacher, Mrs. Chen, who said he had natural ability. But the lessons had to stop when money got tight. That was 15 years ago. Now, at the Symphony Hall, David was surrounded by everything he'd ever wanted but could never have. He watched famous pianists practice for hours, their fingers moving across the keys like magic. He memorized every piece they played, humming the melodies while he worked. Sometimes when he was alone in the concert hall, he'd imagine himself on that stage, playing for thousands of people instead of cleaning up after them. The grand piano on the main stage was the most beautiful instrument David had ever seen. It was a Steinway, worth more than he'd make in 5 years. The wood gleamed under the stage lights, and when the musicians played it, the sound filled every corner of the massive hall. David had never touched it. He wasn't allowed to. In fact, there were strict rules about who could even go near the expensive instruments. Every evening after the last performance ended and the musicians went home, David would clean that stage. He'd carefully vacuum around the piano, dust the bench, and polish the floor until it sparkled. But he'd always stop and stare at those keys, wondering what they felt like under his fingers, wondering if he could make them sing the way the professionals did. His supervisor, Mr. Thompson, was a strict man who'd been at the Symphony Hall for 20 years. He'd made it clear from day one that David's job was to clean, not to dream. "Stay in your lane," he'd say whenever he caught David watching the rehearsals for too long. "These people spent decades learning their craft. Don't get ideas above your station." David never talked back. He needed this job. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and it came with health insurance. His mother's medical bills from her diabetes were expensive, and his younger sister was finally in college. Something David made sure of, even if it meant he'd never get that chance himself. But late at night, when David was alone with his old keyboard, he'd play the same pieces. He'd watch the professionals perform earlier that day. His apartment walls were thin, and he had to keep the volume low. But in those quiet moments, David felt like he could be anyone. He could be the person he'd always wanted to be. The other janitors at the Symphony Hall were nice enough, but they thought David was a bit strange. During lunch breaks, while they talked about sports or television shows, David would sit quietly, still humming melodies in his head. He'd tried to join their conversations, but his mind always wandered back to music. "You're too serious, Dave," his coworker Tony would say. "You gotta learn to relax, man. It's just a job." But for David, it was never just a job. Every day he was surrounded by beauty and talent that reminded him of everything he'd given up. Every day was a reminder of the life he could have had if things had been different, if his family had money, if he'd been born into a different world, if he'd been given the same chances as the people he cleaned up after. Still, David never gave up on his music. In his small apartment, surrounded by furniture from thrift stores and walls that needed painting, he'd practice for hours. His fingers had developed calluses from his day job, but they'd also become strong and precise from years of playing. He taught himself complex pieces that even some professional musicians found challenging. Sometimes, David would look up videos of famous pianists performing in concert halls just like the one where he worked. He'd watch their faces as they played, seeing the joy and passion in their expressions. He'd imagine what it would feel like to have thousands of people listening to him, to have his music touch their hearts the way these performances touched his. But those were just dreams. David knew his place in the world, and it wasn't on stage. It was behind the scenes, invisible and forgotten, making sure everything was perfect for the people who really mattered, the people who belonged there. As winter approached, the Symphony Hall announced its biggest event of the year, the annual Winter Gala. The most famous musicians from around the world would perform, and tickets cost more than David made in a month. For weeks, everyone had been talking about the guest pianist Isabella Santos, who was flying in from Europe specially for this performance. David had watched her videos online. She was incredible, one of the most talented pianists of her generation. The piece she was scheduled to play, Chopin's Piano Concerto No. 1, was one of David's favorites. He'd been practicing it himself for months, though he'd never played it on a real piano, only on his old keyboard at home. The excitement in the building was infectious. Extra security was hired. The hall was decorated with expensive flowers. Even the janitors were given special instructions about keeping everything absolutely perfect for the big night. David tried to share in the excitement, but mostly it just reminded him of how far away he was from that world. He'd be working during the gala, cleaning up messes and emptying trash cans while Isabella Santos performed the music he'd dreamed of playing his entire life. But fate has a funny way of changing everything in a single moment. And for David Rodriguez, that moment was coming sooner than he could have ever imagined. December 15th started like any other day for David Rodriguez. The Winter Gala was scheduled for that evening, and the entire Symphony Hall buzzed with nervous energy. Flowers arrived by the truckload. Catering staff rushed through the hallways. Security guards checked and double-checked every entrance. David had been assigned to work the evening shift, which meant he'd be there during the actual performance. While Isabella Santos played Chopin for an audience of wealthy donors and music lovers, David would be emptying trash cans and cleaning spills in the lobby. The day dragged on slowly. David watched as Isabella arrived for her final sound check. She was smaller than he'd imagined from her videos, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. But when she sat at the grand piano and began to play, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Even from the back of the concert hall, where David was supposed to be dusting chairs, he could hear every note perfectly. Isabella's interpretation of Chopin was different from the recordings he'd listened to at home. It was more emotional, more personal. David found himself stopping his work completely, just listening. "Rodriguez," Mr. Thompson's sharp voice cut through the music. "What are you doing? Get back to work." David snapped back to reality and grabbed his cleaning supplies. But the music stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. He kept humming the melody while he worked, his fingers unconsciously moving as if they were pressing piano keys instead of pushing a mop. As evening approached, the guests began arriving. David had never seen so many expensive cars in the parking lot. Women in designer dresses and men in perfectly tailored suits filled the lobby. The contrast between their world and his felt sharper than ever. During the performance, David was stationed in the lobby, far from the concert hall. He could hear the music faintly through the closed doors, but it wasn't the same as being inside. Every now and then, when the audience applauded, David would pause in his cleaning and wish he could see what was happening on that stage. The performance ended around 10 p.m. David heard the thunderous applause that seemed to go on forever. Slowly, the guests began filing out of the concert hall, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of having witnessed something truly special. "Incredible," one woman said to her husband as they passed David. "I've never heard Chopin played with such passion." "Isabella Santos is a true artist," her husband replied. "Worth every penny." David nodded politely as they walked by, but inside his heart ached a little. He wondered what it would feel like to receive applause like that, to know that hundreds of people had been moved by something you created. By 11:30 p.m., the last guests had left. The catering staff had packed up their equipment, the musicians had gone home, even most of the other janitors had finished their work for the night. David was one of the few people left in the building, tasked with cleaning the main concert hall after the big event. The security guard, Joe, was an older man who'd been working at the Symphony Hall even longer than Mr. Thompson. He was friendly enough, but he took his job seriously. "I'm going to check the other buildings," Joe told David as he headed for the exit. "The concert hall is all yours. Lock up when you're done and set the alarm." David had done this routine hundreds of times before. He grabbed his cleaning cart and headed into the concert hall, where the ghost of Isabella's performance still seemed to linger in the air. The stage looked different in the dim emergency lighting. The grand piano sat center stage, exactly where Isabella had left it after her final bow. The flowers that had decorated the stage were wilting slightly, and there were programs scattered on the floor where audience members had dropped them. David began his usual routine. Sweep the aisles, pick up the programs, empty the small trash bins near the seats, wipe down the railings. But as he worked, his eyes kept drifting to that piano. In all his 3 years at the Symphony Hall, David had never been completely alone with the grand piano. There was always someone around, other staff members, security guards, musicians. But tonight, for the first time, it was just him and the instrument that had been calling to him for so long. David tried to focus on his work. He told himself that looking was enough, that dreaming was enough. He didn't need to actually touch the piano to appreciate it, but as he swept closer to the stage, the pull became stronger. The piano seemed to glow under the soft stage lights that were always left on for safety reasons. David could see his reflection in the polished black surface of the instrument. He climbed the steps to the stage, telling himself he was just going to clean around the piano, nothing more. Up close, the Steinway was even more beautiful than he'd imagined. Every detail was perfect, from the smooth curves of the body to the pristine white and black keys. David had read about this particular piano online. It was worth over $200,000 and had been played by some of the greatest musicians in history. The thought that his fingers might touch the same keys that had been touched by musical legends made his heart race. He looked around the empty hall. The security cameras were there, but Joe had mentioned that the recording system was being updated and wouldn't be working for another week. David was truly alone. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at the keys, his hands, still rough, from years of cleaning, trembled slightly as he imagined what it would feel like to press just one key, just to hear the sound this incredible instrument could make. Just one note, David whispered to himself. No one will ever know. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and pressed middle C. The sound that came from the piano was unlike anything he'd ever heard. It was rich and warm and seemed to fill every corner of the massive hall. David felt the vibration through his fingertips, through his entire body. That one note changed everything. Before he knew what he was doing, David was sitting on the piano bench. His cleaning cart stood forgotten at the edge of the stage. His hands hovered over the keys, shaking with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "This is crazy," he said out loud. His voice echoed in the empty hall. "You'll get fired. You'll lose everything." But the piano seemed to be calling to him. All those years of practicing on his old keyboard, all those nights of dreaming about this moment had led him here. David placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first piece that came from his fingers was the same Chopin ballade that he'd been working on at home for months, but hearing it on this piano was like hearing it for the first time. Every note was crystal clear. Every emotion in the music came through with perfect clarity. As David played, something magical happened. The nervousness melted away. The fear disappeared. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. The piece that had always felt slightly clumsy on his old keyboard now flowed like water. David closed his eyes and let the music take control. He didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows at the back of the concert hall. He didn't see Isabella Santos, who had returned to retrieve a piece of jewelry she'd left in her dressing room. He didn't know that one of the greatest pianists in the world was listening to him play, her mouth open in complete shock. David played for 15 minutes, moving from the Chopin ballade to other pieces he'd memorized over the years. Bach, Mozart, Rachmaninoff. His fingers seemed to remember everything he'd ever learned. The music poured out of him like it had been waiting his entire life for this moment. When he finally stopped, the silence in the hall felt deafening. David sat for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened. He'd actually done it. He'd played the grand piano, and it had been everything he'd dreamed it would be. That's when he heard the slow clapping coming from the back of the hall. David's blood turned to ice. He spun around on the piano bench, his heart hammering in his chest. There, walking slowly down the center aisle, was Isabella Santos herself. "Please," David stammered, jumping up from the bench. "I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to. I was just—" But Isabella held up her hand, silencing him. Her face was serious but not angry. She looked more surprised than upset. "How long have you been playing?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustics of the hall. David's mouth went dry. He was going to lose his job, maybe even face criminal charges for unauthorized use of the piano. His life was over. I taught myself," he managed to say. "I'm sorry. I'll never do it again." Isabella reached the stage and looked up at him. "Taught yourself? That's impossible. No one plays Chopin like that without years of formal training." "I watch videos," David said quietly. "Online, and I practice at home on an old keyboard." Isabella stared at him for a long moment. Then, to David's amazement, she smiled. "Play something else," she said. "Ma'am, you heard me. Play something else. Right now." David's world was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. David stood frozen on the stage, staring down at Isabella Santos. The world-famous pianist was asking him to play more, but his mind couldn't process what was happening. This had to be some kind of test. Maybe she was deciding how much trouble he should get into. I should go," David said, stepping away from the piano bench. "I'm really sorry, Ms. Santos. I know I shouldn't have touched the piano. I'll clean up and leave right away." Isabella shook her head. "You don't understand what you just played. That level of musical expression doesn't happen by accident. Where did you really study?" "Nowhere," David said honestly. "I told you, I taught myself. I work here. I'm just the janitor." Isabella's eyes widened. She looked at David's uniform, his cleaning cart still sitting at the edge of the stage, and back at his face. "You work here? As a janitor?" David nodded, feeling smaller by the second. 3 years now. I clean the stages after performances. That's how I know all the music. I hear it every day." For a moment, Isabella just stared at him. Then she walked up the steps to the stage, moving closer to the piano. "Sit down," she said firmly. "Ma'am, I really should sit down and play something else, please." There was something in her voice that made David obey. He sat back down on the bench, his hands shaking again. This time, the fear was different. He wasn't just afraid of getting in trouble anymore. He was afraid of disappointing someone who actually seemed to care about his playing. "What would you like me to play?" David asked quietly. Isabella thought for a moment. "Do you know Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement?" David's heart skipped. It was one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano repertoire. I know it, but I've never played it on a real piano before, only on my keyboard at home. Try it, Isabella said, settling into a seat in the front row. David took a deep breath and placed his hands on the keys. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto are haunting and powerful, requiring both technical skill and deep emotional understanding. On his old keyboard at home, David had always felt like something was missing, but on this Steinway, every note rang out with perfect clarity. As he played, David forgot about Isabella watching him. He forgot about his fear of getting fired. He forgot about everything except the music flowing through his fingers. The piece was demanding, with rapid passages that required years of practice to master. But somehow David's hands knew exactly what to do. The music built to the first movement's dramatic climax, and David put everything he had into those final, thundering chords. When the last note faded away, the silence in the hall felt electric. David looked up to find Isabella staring at him with tears in her eyes. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You can't play like that without formal training. You can't have that level of technique and musical understanding without studying with masters." "But I did," David said. "I mean, I didn't have masters, I just listened and practiced every single day for 15 years. Isabella stood up and walked over to the piano. "Show me your hands." David held out his hands, feeling self-conscious about the calluses and rough skin from his cleaning work. Isabella examined his fingers carefully. "These hands have worked hard," she said. "But look at the strength in them. Look at the span." She pressed her own hands against David's for comparison. "You have perfect hands for piano. The finger length, the reach between fingers. It's ideal." David had never thought about his hands being special. They were just tools for his work, both cleaning and playing. "Play something of your own choice," Isabella said. "Something you love." David didn't hesitate this time. He began playing Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, a piece that had been the first complex composition he'd ever learned. It was elegant and playful, and on this piano it sounded like pure joy. As he played, Isabella walked around the piano, listening from different angles. David could feel her studying every aspect of his technique, his posture, his hand position, the way he used the pedals. When he finished, she was smiling. "David," she said, and hearing his name from her lips was surreal. "How old are you?" 29. "And you've been playing for 15 years? "Yes, ma'am, since I was 14. Isabella sat down on the edge of the stage. "I started playing when I was 4 years old. I had the best teachers money could buy. I went to conservatory. I've been performing professionally for 20 years. And you..." She paused, shaking her head in amazement. "You play with more natural musicality than students I've met who've studied for decades." David didn't know what to say. He'd never had anyone talk about his playing this way before. His mother had always been supportive, but she didn't know enough about music to understand what she was hearing. "There's something I need to tell you," Isabella continued. "Tomorrow night we're having a special performance for donors and music. School students, it's more informal than tonight's gala. I was planning to play solo, but..." She looked at David thoughtfully. "Would you be willing to play something? Just one piece?" David's heart stopped. "You want me to perform? In front of people?" "Just one piece, nothing too formal. I think there are people who need to hear what you can do." "But I'm not a real pianist," David said. "I don't have training or education or..." "You have something more important than any of that," Isabella interrupted. "You have talent. Raw, incredible talent. And you have passion. I can hear it in every note you play." David thought about his mother, who had always believed in him. He thought about all those nights practicing alone in his apartment. He thought about all the times he dreamed of playing for an audience. "What if I mess up?" he asked. Isabella laughed. "Everyone messes up sometimes, even professionals. The question is, do you want to spend the rest of your life wondering what if?" David looked around the empty concert hall. Tomorrow night, it would be filled with people. Real musicians and music students who would know immediately if he didn't belong there. The thought terrified him, but it also excited him in a way he'd never felt before. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it." Isabella clapped her hands together. "Wonderful. But we need to make sure you're ready. Can you come here early, tomorrow, before your shift starts?" I have to work," David said. "My supervisor won't understand if I'm late." "Leave that to me," Isabella said with a smile. "I think I can arrange something." The next morning, David woke up wondering if the whole thing had been a dream. But when he arrived at work, Mr. Thompson was waiting for him with a strange expression on his face. "Rodriguez," he said, "I got a call this morning from Ms. Santos. She wants to work with you on something today. You're excused from your regular duties." David couldn't believe it. "Really?" "Don't let it go to your head," Mr. Thompson warned. "You're still a janitor here. Whatever this is about, don't forget your place." But David was already forgetting his place. For the first time in his life, he was stepping into a world where his dreams might actually come true. When he met Isabella at the piano that morning, she had music sheets with her. "I thought we'd work on the piece you played last night, the Chopin Ballade. But I want to help you polish some of the technical aspects." For the next 3 hours, David received the piano lesson of his lifetime. Isabella corrected his posture, refined his pedal technique, and helped him understand the emotional story behind each phrase of the music. It was everything he'd ever wanted and never thought he'd have. "You're a natural student," Isabella told him during a break. "You absorb everything so quickly." "I've been waiting my whole life for someone to teach me," David admitted. As the afternoon approached, other staff members began arriving for the evening's performance. Word had somehow spread that the janitor was going to play piano, and David could feel people staring at him as he practiced. "Are you nervous?" Isabella asked as the first guests began arriving. David's hands were shaking again. In a few hours he would be performing for an audience. Everything he'd dreamed about was about to become real. "Terrified," he admitted. Isabella smiled. "Good. That means it matters to you. Now let's show them what you can do." The donor appreciation evening was smaller than the previous night's gala, but to David the audience of 200 people might as well have been 20,000. He stood backstage, wearing a borrowed black suit that Isabella had somehow arranged for him. It was the nicest outfit he'd ever worn, but he felt like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Through the curtains, David could see the audience settling into their seats. There were wealthy donors who supported the Symphony Hall, music students from the local conservatory, and several professional musicians who had come to hear Isabella's informal performance. None of them knew that a janitor was about to take the stage. "I can't do this," David whispered to Isabella, who was calmly reviewing her own music nearby. "These people paid money to hear real musicians. They're going to know I don't belong here." Isabella looked up from her sheet music.
"David, do you remember what I told you yesterday? You have something that can't be taught in any music school. You have soul. But what if I forget the notes? What if my hands shake too much to play? What if, then you'll be human." Isabella
Interrupted gently. "Even the greatest performers have bad nights. But I've heard you play and I know what you're capable of. Trust yourself." Mr. Thompson appeared backstage looking uncomfortable in his formal suit. "Rodriguez, I still can't believe this is happening. Don't embarrass the Symphony Hall, you understand?" "Leave him alone, Thompson," Isabella said firmly. "David is going to be magnificent." The stage manager approached them. "Ms. Santos, we're ready for you to begin." Isabella stood up and smoothed her performance dress. She would be opening the evening with 2 solo pieces and then David would perform. The plan was simple. Isabella would introduce him as a talented musician who works here at the Symphony Hall, without mentioning that he was a janitor. They wanted his music to speak first, before people could form judgments based on his background. "I'll see you out there," Isabella said to David, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. David watched from the wings as Isabella walked onto the stage to warm applause. She settled at the piano and began her first piece, a beautiful Debussy composition that filled the hall with shimmering melodies. Even in his nervous state, David was amazed by her artistry. Every note was perfect. Every phrase told a story. After her second piece, Isabella stood and addressed the audience. "Thank you for that wonderful reception. Tonight is special because I want to share something extraordinary with you. Recently, I discovered a musician whose talent took my breath away. He's completely self-taught, and he's going to play Chopin's A. Ballade number 1 for you tonight. Please welcome David Rodriguez." The applause was polite but curious as David walked onto the stage. He could see people in the audience looking puzzled, probably wondering why they'd never heard of him before. The stage lights were brighter than he'd expected, and for a moment he felt dizzy. David sat at the piano bench and adjusted the height slightly, the way Isabella had taught him. He looked out at the audience, and suddenly the faces didn't seem quite so scary. These were people who loved music just like he did. They were here because they wanted to be moved by beautiful sounds, just like he'd been moved every day for the past 3 years. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade number 1 are gentle and questioning, like someone telling the beginning of a story. David had played this piece hundreds of times in his apartment, but tonight every note seemed to carry extra weight. The acoustics of the concert hall supported each phrase, allowing the music to breathe and grow. As David played, something magical happened. The nervousness melted away just like it had the night before when Isabella first heard him. The music took over, and David found himself lost in the story the piece was telling. His hands moved with confidence across the keys, shaping each phrase with the musical instincts he'd developed over years of careful listening and practice. In the audience, people began to sit up straighter. The piece was technically demanding, with rapid passages and complex harmonies, but David navigated them with ease. More importantly, his interpretation was deeply personal. He wasn't just playing the notes, he was sharing his heart. About halfway through the piece, David noticed something that made his pulse quicken. People in the audience were completely still. No one was coughing or shifting in their seats. Every person in that hall was hanging on every note he played. Even the music students, who probably heard this piece performed regularly, were leaning forward with fascination. The piece built toward its dramatic middle section, where the gentle opening theme transforms into something passionate and urgent. David's fingers flew across the keys, but every note was controlled and intentional. He'd practiced this section so many times that it felt like second nature. As he played, David caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. There was Joe, the security guard, sitting in the back row with his mouth open in shock. Tony, one of his fellow janitors, was there too, looking like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Even Mr. Thompson was watching with the expression of complete amazement. The final section of the ballade is both triumphant and melancholy, requiring the pianist to balance technical brilliance with deep emotion. David poured everything he had into those final minutes, all his years of dreaming, all his nights of practice, all his love for music that had sustained him through the hardest times in his life. When the last note faded away, the silence in the hall was deafening. David sat at the piano, hardly believing what had just happened. He'd actually done it. He'd performed Chopin in front of a real audience. Then the applause began. It started slowly, with one person clapping, then another. But within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding thunderously. David looked out at the standing ovation and felt tears welling up in his eyes. People were smiling, some wiping away tears of their own. The applause went on, for what felt like forever. David stood up from the piano bench and took a bow, still hardly believing this was real. In the front row, he could see Isabella clapping enthusiastically, her face glowing with pride. As the applause finally began to die down, David heard someone in the audience shout, "Bravo!" Then others joined in. "Magnificent! Incredible! More!" Isabella returned to the stage and put her arm around David's shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, "David Rodriguez." The applause erupted again, even louder than before. David looked out at all those faces, faces that were looking at him with respect, with admiration, with the kind of appreciation he'd only dreamed of receiving. After the performance, people crowded around David backstage. Music students wanted to know where he'd studied. Donors asked about his upcoming concerts. Professional musicians introduced themselves and praised his interpretation. "That was extraordinary," said Dr. Williams, the head of the local music conservatory. "Where did you train? I don't recognize your style, but it's absolutely captivating." David looked at Isabella, unsure how to answer. She nodded encouragingly. "I didn't train anywhere formally," David said. "I taught myself." Dr. Williams looked stunned. "Self-taught? That's impossible. No one plays Chopin like that without years of professional instruction." "David works here at the Symphony Hall," Isabella explained. "He's been surrounded by music for years, absorbing everything, teaching himself in his spare time." The crowd around David grew larger as word spread about his background. People wanted to hear his story, to understand how someone could develop such talent in isolation. "What do you do here at the Symphony Hall?" asked one of the donors. David hesitated. He'd been honest about everything else. "Why stop now?" "I'm a janitor," he said simply. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs of amazement, and then even more enthusiastic congratulations. People seemed even more impressed by his performance now that they knew his background. "This is incredible," said Dr. Williams. "David, I'd like to talk to you about some opportunities. Real opportunities." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, David found himself alone with Isabella for a moment. "How do you feel?" she asked. David thought about it. A few hours ago, he'd been terrified. Now he felt like his life had completely changed direction. "Like I'm finally who I was supposed to be," he said. Isabella smiled. "This is just the beginning, David. After tonight, everything is going to be different." She was right. By the next morning, word about the janitor pianist had spread throughout the city's music community. David's phone was ringing with interview requests, performance opportunities, and offers he'd never imagined possible. But the most important call came from Dr. Williams at the conservatory. "David," he said, "I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to our graduate program. We've never had a student with your background, but after last night, I think we need to make an exception." David stared at the phone, hardly believing what he was hearing. A full scholarship to music school. It was everything he'd ever dreamed of and more. "What about my job?" David asked. "I need to work to support my family." "We'll work something out," Dr. Williams said. "Talent like yours doesn't come along often. We're not going to let it slip away." As David hung up the phone, he realized that his life as an invisible janitor was over. The performance had changed everything, just like Isabella had predicted. 6 months after that life-changing performance, David Rodriguez stood in the same concert hall where his journey had begun. But this time, everything was different. The stage was set for his debut recital as a student at the conservatory, and every seat in the house was sold out. The months between that first performance and tonight had been a whirlwind. David had started his studies at the conservatory while continuing to work part-time at the Symphony Hall, though now his duties had changed from cleaning to helping with educational programs. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was teaching music appreciation to young students in the same building where he'd once been invisible. His mother sat in the front row, wearing a new dress that David had bought for her with money from his first paid performance. Her diabetes was under better control now, thanks to the health insurance that came with his conservatory scholarship. Next to her sat his sister Anna, who had graduated from college the month before and was starting her dream job as a teacher. "I can't believe this is real," his mother whispered to Anna as they waited for the concert to begin. "My David, performing for all these people." Anna squeezed her mother's hand. "David always had talent, Mom. He just needed someone to believe in him." Backstage, David was going through his pre-performance routine. He'd learned to manage his nerves better over the past few months, but tonight felt special. This wasn't just another performance, it was his formal debut as a serious musician. Isabella Santos was there, of course. She'd become not just his mentor but his friend. Over the past 6 months, she'd worked with him regularly, helping him refine his technique and prepare for tonight's demanding program. "How are you feeling?" she asked as David warmed up on a practice piano backstage. "Ready," David said, and he meant it. The scared janitor who had stumbled onto this stage 6 months ago was gone. In his place was a confident musician who had worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life to earn his place here. The program for tonight's recital was ambitious. David would be performing works by Bach, Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and ending with a piece he'd composed himself, something that had emerged during his studies when his professor encouraged him to explore his own musical voice. Dr. Williams had become one of David's strongest supporters at the conservatory. In 40 years of teaching, he often told people, "I've never seen anyone absorb musical knowledge so quickly. David makes up for lost time by working twice as hard as anyone else." The audience began filing into the concert hall. David peeked through the curtains and saw faces both familiar and new. There were his former co-workers from the symphony hall, including Mr. Thompson, who had become surprisingly supportive once he got over his initial shock. There were his classmates from the conservatory, other musicians who had become his friends and biggest cheerleaders. But there were also strangers. People who had heard about the janitor-turned-pianist and wanted to hear his story through his music. The local newspaper had written a feature article about David's journey, and word had spread throughout the music community and beyond. Tony, his former fellow janitor, was there with his wife and kids. "Can you believe our Dave is doing this?" he said loudly enough for several rows to hear. "Used to eat lunch with this guy every day. Never knew he could play a note." As the lights dimmed and David walked onto the stage, the applause was warm and encouraging. He'd learned to appreciate these moments before the music began. The anticipation in the air, the connection between performer and audience, the privilege of sharing something beautiful with people who had chosen to spend their evening listening to him. David began with Bach's Goldberg Variations, a piece that had challenged him technically, but allowed him to showcase the precise mathematical beauty he'd come to love about Baroque music. His months of formal training had refined his technique, but his natural musicality, that indefinable quality that had first impressed Isabella, remained unchanged. As he played, David thought about the journey that had brought him here. The years of practicing alone in his apartment, the nights when he'd wondered if his dreams were foolish, the moment when Isabella had discovered him and changed his life forever. The Bach flowed seamlessly into Chopin's Piano Sonata No. 2, including the famous Funeral March movement. David's interpretation was deeply personal, drawing from his own experiences of loss and struggle. When he'd first learned this piece, he'd connected with its themes of hardship and perseverance. Tonight, he played it with the understanding of someone who had lived through difficult times and emerged stronger. During the intermission, the buzz in the lobby was electric. People were amazed not just by David's technical skill, but by the maturity and depth of his musical interpretation. "He plays like someone who's been performing for decades," one music critic whispered to another. "You can hear his life experience in every phrase." "It's remarkable," replied the other critic. "Usually when we hear about these late-blooming talents, there's something missing, some aspect of their musicianship that shows their lack of formal training. But with David, it's the opposite. His unconventional background seems to have given him something extra." The second half of the program featured Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2, a piece that David had been working on since his first week at the conservatory. It was technically demanding and emotionally complex, requiring both physical stamina and musical sophistication. As David played the Rachmaninoff, he felt completely in his element. This was the piece where his natural talent and his formal training came together perfectly. His hands, strong from years of physical work, could handle the technical demands easily. His musical instincts, developed through years of careful listening, guided his interpretation. The audience was completely captivated. Even other pianists in the audience found themselves leaning forward, impressed by passages that they knew from experience were extremely difficult to execute. But the real surprise came at the end of the program. David had composed a piece he called Night Shift, a musical reflection on his years working at the Symphony Hall, watching and learning from the shadows. It began quietly, almost mysteriously, representing the empty halls late at night. Then it built into something more complex, weaving together themes from various classical pieces he'd heard over the years, but transforming them into something entirely his own. The composition told the story of someone on the outside looking in, gradually finding their way into the light. It was deeply personal, but it spoke to universal themes of aspiration and transformation. As the final notes of Night Shift faded away, the silence in the hall was profound. Then the applause began, not just polite appreciation, but the kind of thunderous, heartfelt ovation reserved for truly special performances. David stood and bowed, looking out at the standing crowd. In the front row, his mother was crying tears of joy. Isabella was beaming with pride. His classmates were cheering enthusiastically. But what moved David most were the faces throughout the audience, people who had been touched by his music, who had connected with his story, who understood that they had witnessed something remarkable. After the concert, the reception was overwhelmed with people wanting to congratulate David and hear more about his journey. Record company representatives introduced themselves. Concert promoters talked about future performances. Music educators asked about his teaching methods. "David," said one well-dressed woman who introduced herself as a talent agent, "I'd like to discuss some opportunities with you. There are people in New York and Los Angeles who would love to hear you play." But the conversation that meant the most to David came from a young man who approached him hesitantly near the end of the evening. "Mr. Rodriguez," the young man said, "my name is Luis. I work in the kitchen at the conservatory. I've been teaching myself guitar, but I always thought I wasn't good enough to be a real musician because I don't have formal training." David smiled and put his hand on Luis's shoulder. "What's your dream?" he asked. "I want to compose music," Luis said quietly. "But I thought it was impossible for someone like me." "6 months ago I was cleaning this stage," David said. "Tonight, I performed on it. Nothing is impossible if you're willing to work for it." Luis's eyes lit up with hope. "Really? Really? And if you want, I'd be happy to listen to some of your compositions sometime." As the reception wound down and people began to leave, David found himself alone on the stage for a moment. The same stage where he'd discovered his destiny, where Isabella had first heard him play, where he'd just given the performance of his life. Isabella joined him, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a moment. "So what's next?" she asked. David thought about all the opportunities that had been presented to him tonight. Concert tours, recording contracts, teaching positions. A year ago, he would have been overwhelmed by so many choices. Now he felt ready for whatever came next. "I want to keep growing as a musician," he said. "I want to perform for people who love music, and I want to help other people like Luis, people who have talent but think they don't belong in this world." Isabella nodded approvingly. "You know, David, when I first heard you play, I was amazed by your talent. But tonight I'm even more impressed by the person you've become.